Hey, I saw you grin a little bit when I was reading that piece about Irenaeus calling Papias, a man of little intelligence. The early church fathers weren't politically correct, were they?
No, they weren't. We sometimes get this image in our mind that they were exactly the way they appear in icons. Sometimes you see these Eastern icons and the fathers are all standing in a line perfectly straight, and they all have these big identical beards, and they're looking grave, but they had humor. They had strong opinions, and as you mentioned, they weren't always politically correct.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's why it's so fun and it's refreshing to read the early church fathers, because they don't mince words. They lay it out on the table. Sometimes they could be pretty abrupt.
Yes.
Of course, but they're nevertheless holy men. And I think,
yes.
Sometimes we equate holiness with docility, which is true. There is docility to God's will, but not necessarily docility to your fellow man.
No, they weren't pushovers.
Yeah.
They had strong principles, and they were willing to speak in a strong way in order to defend those principles.
Yeah. Yeah. John Chrysostom's an interesting early church father, because I think it rings like a familiar name to a lot of Catholics, mm-hmm. but not as familiar as, say, Augustine or Jerome or Athanasius even. I think he's probably more familiar in the East than here in the West. Am I correct on that?
I think so, because the liturgy that's commonly used in the Byzantine churches is the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. So that name is always coming up. If you look in the pew missal, so to speak, you look down and you see his name no matter what. Also, there's a homily of his that's read every year, on holy days. So, he's someone who keeps appearing in the church's devotional life. If you grew up in one of the Eastern churches, I'd say, you're going to have a much more intense awareness of him than you'd have growing up as we did in the West.
Yeah. Now, being a saint, I imagine his life was pretty boring. Just everything coming up roses.
Oh man,
right?
No. He had a very unusual life. He really did. His father seems to have been a Roman. He was an official in Antioch in Syria, so a big city. All right, one of the major cities of the world at that time. His father died when he was in infancy, so very, very young. When John never knew his father. So he was raised by his mother. His mother made the decision to live in the church as a consecrated widow, right? And she lived with John's aunt Sabiniana, who was what is known as a deaconess in the church. And the three of them lived together in this very strange household, a very unusual household. They lived an intense devotional life. They tried to be good Christians. His mother used the money that the dad had left in order to get John the best education available. At the time, there lived in Antioch the great rhetorician named Libanius, greatest rhetorician of his time. And John studied under Libanius. That's like today, it's like going to Harvard, right? It's gonna get you a good job once you come of age. So John got an excellent education. He got a great formation in the faith, and at a certain point, he decided that he wanted to live a devotion. He wanted to live an ascetical life in community with one of his friends or some of his friends. And he told this to his mother, and she hit the roof.
Wow.
She was not ready to hear this. As devout as she was, she said, "Don't make me a widow again." She didn't want to be left alone. So John continued his ascetical life at home. And after a while, he brought it up with her again, and then she was more prepared for it. And John did go to live with the solitaries on Mount Silpius, this mountain outside the city. And there were a number of solitaries living on the mountain, and John lived an extremely rigorous life. They say he used to fast. He hardly ate anything, and he tried never to sit down or rest, and that he would stay awake long into the night. He would stay up all night with his arms outstretched, standing, so he didn't fall asleep, with the scriptures in front of him, illuminated by torchlight, and he would spend his nights committing the scriptures to memory. This is what he wanted to do. So he would do this in prayer, and he did this for years until he destroyed his health. And the other solitaries on the mountain told him he needed to go back down to the city and be attended to. So once he got down to the city, the bishop snatched him up, made him a deacon, ordained him a deacon, and before too long, John was ordained a priest as well. But that's when he got his nickname, Chrysostom, which means golden mouth, because of his preaching. But he had been prepared for this preaching professionally by Libanius, right? The greatest rhetorician of his time, but also spiritually on the mountain through fasting and vigils and through study of the scripture, immersion in the scripture until he had much of the Bible committed to memory.
Yeah, that's interesting because, the whole idea of rhetorician is to communicate with others. And then to go into solitude, I could see where his mother would be upset, right? Because it's kind of throwing away his education. But instead, what he does is he imbibes scripture. And now, instead of engaging in pagan rhetoric, now he can engage in Christian homiletics. And like you said, he was pretty good, even though he didn't have any practical experience being alone in the cave all that time.
Yes, and Libanius was a pagan. Libanius was the last of the articulate pagans, and he was the great professor of Julian the Apostate, the ex-Christian emperor who tried to repaganize the empire, and leaned on Libanius a lot for his advice as he was trying to carry out that program. Julian didn't succeed, but he did make Libanius even more of a star than he had been.
Yeah, so I remember reading something about Libanius on his deathbed, and they were asking who's going to succeed him. And purportedly, he says, John, if not the Christians had snatched him or something like that.
Yes. So, you think about this. Poor Libanius, right? He was the teacher of John Chrysostom, Basil the Great, and Gregory of Nazianzus, right? So at least he had those guys praying for his soul afterwards.
Many twists and turns in John's life. First, his father dies when he's just an infant. He's raised in this household that's very religious. They send him to the best rhetorician out there. So essentially, like you said, it's like Harvard. And it's probably like the best professor at Harvard. And then he ends up in the mountains by himself. And then they send him back down, and now he's the pastor of souls. And he adapts, he just soaks up like a sponge, adapts, and he just goes great guns in whatever direction he's in.
He adapts and he excels. An interesting crisis comes to Antioch, and crises were often coming to Antioch. I mentioned Julian the Apostate when just a little while ago, and Julian made Antioch his headquarters during the year when he was trying to repaganize the Roman Empire. He didn't succeed, but the people in Antioch saw it up close, and that was John's adolescence there. So John got to witness this as it was happening. Another crisis came to Antioch just a few years later in the time of Theodosius. Theodosius's reign began in 379, so 16 years after Julian's death. So Theodosius enacts this tax. Nobody likes to be taxed, right? Right. But it's going to hit the people of Antioch, and they're not happy about it. And they have something of a demonstration in the streets. The demonstration gets out of hand, and people get a little rowdy, a little crazy. Somebody probably had a little too much to drink, and they knock down the statues of the imperial family. Now, that's like burning a flag. It's like It's in Roman law, that's considered the equivalent of knocking down the person himself. Now, you try to knock down the emperor, you're gonna end up dead on the spot, right?
Right.
Well, these people in Antioch were they're prepared for the worst. There's a good possibility he would just mow them down or enact vengeance in some way. So everyone's terrified. What do? They go to church, right? Remember the day after 9/11 in 2001, everybody went to church suddenly, right? What do? We're scared. We're confused. We go to church. So that's what happened. Everybody went to church, and John went in there, young John, he went in there, and he preached one of the most famous series of homilies ever preached in all of history. And this is really the kind of thing that won him the name Chrysostom, won him the name Golden Mouth, that he'll carry with him for the rest of history now. But he preached these homilies, and it wasn't just a soothing, everything's going to be okay. He acknowledged that there could be real danger ahead, that there could be serious consequences to this. But he called the people to an examination of conscience. He said, "Consider this. You're facing death, and this is a gift. Make the most of it. Turn your lives around." And it's a wonderful series of homilies. It's called his homilies on the statues, and the people received them gratefully, and there were many conversions. A lot of people turned their lives around because of those homilies, and they gave him an international reputation. That's when he became known to people outside his own city. It was a major city, but this really made him world famous and put him on everyone's radar, even the emperors.